Right. Hi, everyone. So it's a pleasure to see everyone here. And it's my turn to hand off the baton to Professor Philipp Afèche, who will be running two really interesting sessions on ride-hailing. Philipp is a professor at the University of Toronto at the Rotman School. And he's an expert on ride-hailing systems. And we'll hand it off to him, and really looking forward to seeing the sessions, Philipp.
Okay, thank you, Florin. Thanks everyone for coming. Let me share my screen. Can everybody see that? Yeah, okay, great. All right, so okay, so my session here has the title On-Demand Platforms with Time-Sensitive Customers. And then the sort of sub-phrase here is ride-hailing models. And just to connect to what Florin did in his session, I think you saw this slide here, right? Both of these sessions are running under the header platforms. So platforms aggregate and match supply and demand, and Florin talked about online advertising. I'm going to talk about ride-hailing. And so when I started to think about this, it seems like what are some of the characteristic features of these platforms, right? So they provide some on-demand service. Customers are time sensitive, and in fact, so are providers to some extent. The broad question is, how should you design financial and operational controls to optimize performance? So before we look at some of these questions, I thought it's helpful to think about, if you compare this setting to the settings you've seen in previous modules, right? What are some of the problem characteristics that we have here? How do they compare to those in other settings? What is the same, and what is different? So I don't know whether there's any appetite for discussion, but if there is, I'm happy to hear your thoughts before I give you my thoughts. I don't know, anyone? Okay, no one. All right, well, here's some of what I think about this. So in terms of similarities, right, capacity is limited, at least, the classic setting in RM, capacity is limited, and that's also an issue in ride-hailing platforms, right? Demand is dynamic, comes in over time, stochastic. And in terms of managing things, you can certainly use demand management tools, financial controls, pricing, quantity controls like booking limits and accept, reject requests and so on. But there are some distinctive features. For one, at least in many settings, not in all settings, the supply side is not governed by a single entity, but the control is decentralized in some sense, right? You have strategic self-interested drivers, and so that gives rise to decentralized supply decisions. The platform can influence them and tries to, of course, but in the end, drivers still have a lot of decisions to make that will affect the supply. Another thing which is already in the title is that if you think of the RM settings, the classics of setting, typically the decision that a customer makes is basically based on the price or prices for an assortment of products. Here, time is also important, right? So when I'm thinking of getting the service, I'm thinking of the price-time combination, right? And that's related to the fact that, as the name here suggests, the service is provided on demand, right? As opposed to scheduling a trip long in advance. And then the service, is also then maybe subject to stochastic fluctuations because of various factors, traffic, congestion, etc., etc. Another thing is that over the problem horizon, right, capacity here is reusable, right? So at least in contrast to the classic airline management setting, where you have a flight that's going to take off at a certain time and you're really managing that time horizon. Here, you're thinking of a fleet of cars and drivers, and they will be used for multiple customers, right? So that might be somewhat related to if you're thinking of hotel revenue management, where it's also more of an ongoing thing, or Airbnb or something like that, right? Then, because we have transportation, that's obvious, capacity moves around, but that also has implications, because if you serve demand in one location, that will affect supply in another location. Sticking to the spatial features, right? Space means distance, and that can introduce a variety of so-called frictions, right? For one, there could be structural imbalances in demand, like more demand going out of one location as trips arriving to a location. And then there can also be sort of maybe on a more shorter time scale, even if things are balanced on average, there could be sort of short-term spatial demand supply mismatches, and that leads to inefficiencies, right? So that means that we are going to have a hard time to keep the capacity fully utilized. Capacity needs to move around, sometimes empty, to a customer to pick them up, or to another location in anticipation of more demand there. And so based on that, in addition to all the demand side controls that are sort of classic in revenue management, here you have a bunch of supply side controls, financially wages to the independent drivers, and operationally you can do various things, right? So if you look at this, the full problem is multidimensional and complex. I put these words in quote because complex is maybe an overused word. But essentially, you have really a variety of models that capture partial aspects of this, right? And so, in fact, when I was starting to think about this session, I thought, oh my God, what did I get into here? What can you do in 3 hours to kind of find a good blend between giving some flavor of specifics, but at the same time not get lost in a little corner without having any sort of overview, right? And so that brings me to my thoughts on how I arrived at the 2 sessions that I designed, right? So let me start with a simple taxonomy, maybe a simplistic taxonomy, right? Where I'm thinking of classifying the models along 2 main dimensions, right? One is sort of service locations. Are you looking at a single location? Are you looking at multiple locations? Oops, what went wrong? Right. And the other one has to do with what is the supply side looking like, right? Because even though I emphasize the decentralized nature of supply, there are quite a few papers, and they're quite interesting problems when you fully control the supply, right? The problem is far from trivial, right? So, but still, it's useful to make this distinction. And of course, in all of these things, we're still thinking of demand is responding to incentives, prices, time, and so on, right? So that's kind of common. So some comments here, right? So in each of these settings, you can think of various pricing and revenue management questions that arise, and they can involve either financial controls or operational controls or both, right? Now, when we look at these various boxes, right, this box here is there's a large literature on Q economics and revenue management. And actually the work I've done mostly is in this box, right? I mean, I have recent interest in ride hailing, but that's really where I've done most of my work. Then when you think of single versus multiple location models, and you start reading these papers, there's kind of a variety of ways in which people capture multiple location models, right? So first of all, there's a bunch of models that capture distance mainly through travel cost as opposed to travel time, right? And that still has some value, right? You still get some insights, and sometimes there's arguments of how introducing positive travel times doesn't really alter the results all that much. Then there's also a question of, are individual locations really modeled explicitly, like you have a graph with different nodes and there's demand going from node I to node J, or is the space kind of modeled in a sort of more reduced form in an aggregate way, right? And then when it comes to multi-location models, I think a key question is, are there really spatial demand imbalances or not, right? So, once you introduce multiple locations and distance, in my mind, is sort of, if you want to simplify, there's kind of two things that happen. One, because there's distance now, that's going to cost some time to bridge this distance, right? But then there's also a question of, if you have structural imbalances, that really makes the thing even much more inefficient or much more challenging to improve performance, right? Okay, so looking at this, just to give you an idea of how did I decide to focus for these two sessions, right? So I'm going to focus on models that capture driver time explicitly. And as we will discuss further, if you think of driver time, you can think of, in principle, 4 ways that a driver can spend time, right? Of course, the best way is that they're serving a passenger, right, driving from A to B. Another possibility is that they're idling, maybe without any specific destination in mind, right? They're just waiting for something to happen. And then there's also traveling empty, and there's you can still make a distinction between 2 kinds here. One is kind of reacting to a dispatch, right? So you go with a certain goal in mind, or and this is sometimes called en route, or you're repositioning in some sense. This is more anticipative, right? You're moving in anticipation of, okay, there's better life to be had at a high demand location. Right now, I'm in a location that's kind of dead. Nobody wants me here, right? So in any case, I'm going to sort of focus my discussion more of models that capture some aspects of this time explicitly. Of course, all of them will capture service time. Otherwise, there's nothing to study. But then there will be some selective look at some of these other times. I'm going to put more focus on models that look at decentralized supply. And today, as the session says, it's about single location, but I'm going to expand this a little bit. So a single location model really does not capture spatial aspects, right? I mean, you can make a case that that's a nice benchmark. It's a stylized view of some of the things that might happen with multiple locations, but it's really, sort of a classic fixed servers with fixed locations, right? Between that and sort of the other extreme, where you really have multiple locations and servers are moving around and you're keeping track of everything, there's something that sometimes you can think of as a sort of homogeneous space model, where there's a notion that things happen over, let's say, 2-dimensional space continuously, but that space is really homogeneous. So you're just keeping track of inefficiencies without worrying explicitly about imbalances that happen in a structural way, right? So I think that's sort of a nice view to come up with a stylized, parsimonious model that still gives you some, useful understanding of what to avoid and what to improve in such systems. So this is kind of visually speaking, I am sort of in single location, but kind of going into the multiple location world, right? And then in the next session, which I think is on Monday, is going to look at a couple of models where you have multiple locations with demand imbalances, again, focusing on decentralized supply, but touching a little bit on related models where you actually control the flow of cars. Okay. Now some
Philipp?
comments on just to set your expectations, right? So, if you sort of look at this area, it's kind of a big area. I mean, there's other big areas, but it's big and growing. And I think it's fair to say that it's in some sense less mature than classic RM. So there's a variety of models that capture aspects of the problem, right? And if you look at methodologies, it's really sort of a blend of stochastics and queuing on the one hand, and then, we need to model incentives and decentralized decision making, right? And so when I looked at this and I said, oh, we have 3 hours, not 30 hours, I decided to use the following approach, right? I'll give you sort of a selective cocktail of questions, problems, models, results. Hopefully there's some system and reason behind this selection. We have this session is like the whole sequence is titled stochastic modeling. So stochastics will show up to a degree, right? But I'm not going to get into the details of stochastic analysis and proofs and, approximation theorems and that kind of thing, right? The way this is often going to show up is, well, the system is dynamic, even if you run with a static policy. So that will give rise to some steady state mean performance, and that performance you can influence through your decisions, right? But this is kind of how the stochastics will tend to show up here, right? Which might be a little bit different than what you've seen in the earlier sessions. And so just to reinforce this, it's not going to be a how-to manual on stochastic analysis, right? So hopefully, that calibrates your expectations, right? And so what I want to focus on next is I will basically discuss a single location model, and I'm going to focus on a particular paper, and then at the end of that discussion connect to related papers and related ideas. But I think it's helpful to sort of think of one specific category of models. It kind of helps us anchor the specific modeling choices. You can sort of see advantages, drawbacks, shortcomings, and hopefully that will give you an idea of what else one could do, right? In some sense,
can I ask a question?
Yes, please. By the way, I forgot to say you can stop me at any time. So, yeah.
Okay, good. So, can you give us a hint of the kind of time scale that you have in mind? So you mentioned all sorts of decision makers like drivers, passengers, platforms. Right. So I guess like the kind of decisions that passengers make are sort of myopic. They want service. They, either get it at a certain price or not. But the drivers are,
Yeah. So
I think comment.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's a great question. I think, so I think one thing that's interesting, especially when you introduce drivers that have their own objectives, there is a disconnect in timescales, as you alluded to, where the passengers typically, at least in, if not all models, the vast majority of models, they make sort of transactional decisions, right? Now, there are models, I think, or there should be models that also consider customers having, memory based on past service, right? And that might influence their future decisions. But typically, it's very much, I want one trip. This is my time scale. This is my impatience. This is my willingness to pay. What's available, right? For the drivers, I think it's an interesting, and I think that's an interesting area to do more modeling, right? So, but typically you can think of them, I think the models that I'm aware of, I don't know what is exactly the time, but I would say the time scale is on the order of hours, right? So then the question is, and the decisions that typically drivers make, right? There's certainly a participation decision, right? And then if you participate, there's also decisions on, do I relocate or not? Sometimes there's a decision, or do I accept or reject a trip or not, right? But I would say it's fair to say that it's on the order of hours, right? And then one can argue what is the appropriate way to model their payoff. But essentially, they would be not looking, I mean, to some extent they're boundedly rational. So it's unclear to what extent they can really anticipate, their earnings under their best behavior while they're in the network and they're competing with other drivers and so on, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, totally.
Or did you have something else in mind in terms of?
Well, there's also the platform who makes decisions. So I guess then we're talking about timescales of months or even
That's
years.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, once we get into the platform objective function, right, there's also arguments that, well, they're not, they're not really just looking at short-term profits, right? They're trying to grow their market. So now they need to balance, in some sense, growth with short-term profits and that kind of thing. I'm not going to get into those things here, but those are certainly important as well, right?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so right, so I'm going to start with a sort of very simple. You can think of this like as a sort of a canonical stylized model of a single location on-demand service platform, right? So you have the platform in the middle. You have time-sensitive customers, independent providers, right? It's a two-sided market. So the platform interacts with these two sides, in this case, only through financial incentives, right? So you can offer a price to customers, a wage to the independent providers. Based on this, the customers will decide, customers decide based on the price and based on their anticipated waiting time, whether to buy or not. The aggregate of these decisions will give rise to a demand rate, right? On the other side, you have a pool of potential providers, which is not the little k here, but out of this pool, a small number, it may be a large number, but it's a small script here. K will choose to join based on their effective wage, right? So the wage taking into account utilization, right? Customer demand is sensitive to price and waiting time, and the supply of providers is sensitive to the wage and the utilization, right? And I think we already talked about the differences to the classic PRM settings, right? Which I think see here, right? For one, you have the waiting time, you have the fact that and this goes back to Ron's question, right? In this type of model, there's a very clear disconnect in the timescales between the customers and the providers, right? And if you think of this in from a sort of taxonomy of queuing models, right? You have the servers that are going to make a long-term decision. I mean, long-term, not months here, but hours maybe. And customers in this setting they kind of come and go. They're not going to plan ahead for months. They just buy trips at a time. Please, Florian.
Maybe a very small detail, but the supply of drive providers, why would it depend on utilization as well? Why not just make it depend on wage?
Oh, because at least, and that's a big topic in, from a regulatory perspective and so on. Typically the platforms would pay drivers only when they're actually driving somebody, like they pay them per job, right? So if I'm thinking of driving for Uber or Lyft or whoever, right? I'm going to say, okay, what do you pay me per distance or time with a passenger, and what percentage of my time can I expect to be busy, right?
I see. So this is sort of W per second, or W while you're
so the
not idle.
W, and then I'll specify this in more detail in a minute, but the W here is going to be a wage rate per unit of distance, right? And of course, in practice, it's a combination of time and distance and so on, right? But so I'm going to then see what percentage of time am I actually utilized, right? And I'm going to multiply that percentage by, so if I make $20 per hour, if I'm fully busy, but I'm only busy 75% of the time, I'm going to account for an effective wage of like $15 per hour, right? As an aside, I think there's a labor economist at Stanford who I read, has studied Uber among others, and has been driving for Uber, so to collect some empirical experience. Anyway, so but that, yeah, so that's that, and that's is important to some extent to understand the interplay between these two sides, right? Now, the following discussion, I will focus on the model and results in this paper by et al. 2018. Actually, like Florian, I guess I haven't included a list of references yet, but I will also certainly do that. So that appeared in MSOM 2018. Now, there's a couple of very closely related papers. I will say a few words about them after we talk about this model, but I just thought it's useful to have a specific model in front of us, right? Okay, so what specific questions? So here, there's no operational controls, right? Things are relatively simple in some sense, right? But you're simply trying to find the right balance between, these two sides. So you're looking at a profit maximizing platform, and it needs to choose the price and the wage. And the specific thing they looked at is, it used to be, and I think it, to some extent still is, but it varies, right? It used to be that there's a sort of fixed commission rate or payout ratio. And then the platform would basically vary the price, maybe in response to changing market conditions. But then because of the fixed commission rate, that would automatically also, vary the wage, right? So they look at that in comparison to, of course, when you can freely choose wage and price, and maybe that will lead to a different ratio between the two, right? Then they do some sort of comparative statics analysis, right, where they say, well, how should these things change if some key conditions change, right? So if you look at, one thing that's which is not just relevant in ride-hailing, but in other settings as well, right? Demand is non-stationary over time, right? Especially you have peak and off-peak hours. So you might think of, how should this change over time, right? So coming back to the question of time scale, right? Maybe, here it's going to be a steady state model. There's a whole queuing kind of discussion on, is it appropriate to study a 2 or 3 hour slice with a stationary model, right? And so on. We'll not get into that, right? But so that model you can think of is maybe valid for something on the order of a couple of hours where things are relatively steady, right? But then things might change. And so the question would be, how should you adjust prices and wages in response to these changes, right? So here, this is to be clearly distinguished from sort of faster state-dependent dynamic pricing, where you respond to stochastic fluctuations in queue lengths and so on, right? And then, obviously an obvious question is, what is the benefit of making the payout ratio dependent on, which hour or which demand regime you operate in, right? So this is a picture of the different model components, and I'm just going to spend a few minutes on each component. Right, we're going to start with customers, and when you when you look at customers, right, they're basically getting a price, and they're responding to a waiting time. And just to be clear, this is a steady state average waiting time, so this is not dependent on the actual queue length. We can discuss that also later if you want, right? I will later say, okay, where does this waiting time come from? But for now, just suppose you're a customer and you see the price and you anticipate a certain waiting time, and your decision is basically, should you buy or not? And if you aggregate all the customer decisions, right, that's going to give a certain arrival rate lambda. So to develop the model, step by step, there is a potential demand here is exogenous, right? And that's, in this case, it's a Poisson arrival process. I don't think it makes a huge difference if you went to a more general queuing model. But the potential request, think of this as the market size. They arrive at a rate of, lambda cap. Now, not everybody is going to buy, right? The actual demand is going to depend on customer preferences and on the attributes of the service, right? So, and this goes back to Ran's question earlier, right? So here in this model, customers make a decision, trip by trip. So they have sort of unit demand. They're risk neutral, so they care about their expected utility. And in this model, they're heterogeneous only in terms of their price sensitivity, right? So think back to some of the other sessions, right? When you have a certain price, customers arrive, it depends on how does their willingness to pay compare to the price. So in this case, those could vary across customers, but otherwise they're identical. In particular, in this model, everybody has the same delay costs and patience, if you will, right? So the valuations here are, V, you can think of these Vs as, IID draws from a continuous distribution on the unit interval, which come, and the distribution is described according to some CDF F, right? Now the model here, I don't think is necessary, but makes a distinction of how many service units per request, right? So this could be like distance, but they actually assume that ex ante, everybody has the same expectation, right? So it doesn't really capture the fact that, Ron wants to take a trip with, 10 kilometers and Florin wants to go 15 kilometers, and I actually only have a two kilometer trip because I'm just lazy or something like that, right? So I think it's an unnecessary gimmick in the model that I don't think buys you that much, but it's there, so I didn't want to hide it, right? Customers have a unit waiting cost of C, so that's a linear delay cost, right? It's per unit time that they wait for the service, right? And so if you look at a customer with value rate V, their expected utility of getting served is V minus P. The P is the decision of the provider. The W arises through other customers' decisions and everybody's decisions, right? And because of this D, everything is multiplied by D, right? So this P is a price rate per service unit, right? If it's, let's say 50 cents per kilometer and you're going for 20 kilometers, it's going to cost you $10, right? So the demand rate as a function of price and waiting time is going to simply be the market size, and then you aggregate everybody whose value exceeds basically the total cost. And this gives you lambda as a function of the market size and the attributes of the service, which are decision variables, right? And sometimes in this type of analysis, it's helpful to do the analysis in terms of quantities as opposed to prices. So that would be the inverse demand function, right? So a couple of remarks before we move on. Just, sorry. So one observation is that this demand model here is very standard, right? So the box I pointed out earlier with a single location and centralized supply, right? Models like this and more complicated models have been studied extensively, right? But it's an important building block nonetheless, right? So a technical comment here, we're assuming that all these processes, distributions are mutually independent. And then an important assumption or decision in these models is to decide what information do customers have, right? So in this model, they don't see the queue. They don't make their decision based on the conditional delay, depending on how many people are waiting also for cars. And so that simplifies some of the analysis, right? So that's something one could talk about as an additional thing to study, right? Okay, moving on to the providers, right? So the potential supply is also exogenous, right? Let's say there's a pool of people who potentially are willing to provide service to this platform. The actual supply, on the other hand, will depend on the preferences of these providers and on the service utilization, right? So providers are going to decide should they work or not. They're heterogeneous in terms of their opportunity costs, right? So if I don't drive and I still want to work, like what else could I do with my time, right? And different people have different values of their time, right? But otherwise, they're identical in this model, right? And this could be something to consider as well as an alternative, that different people have different possible allocation, right? Maybe somebody wants to work 3 hours, another wants to work, a full day. Some people are faster than others, more skilled than others, etc., right? So that's ignored here. The source of heterogeneity is the reservation wage per unit time. There's a distribution on that. Everybody has the same service rate. And so the expected earnings rate per unit time, given the wage and the utilization, basically is, this is the wage if I'm per unit time, if I work all the time, but I'm only working a fraction of the time. What fraction am I working? Lambda D is the total demand of service units. K times mu is the total capacity or supply of work, right? And assuming that things are, sort of uniformly allocated, I simply get a share of that. That's proportional to the number of servers, right? And so we can write the supply as a function of wage and utilization, similar to what you saw before, and you can translate this also into an inverse supply function, right? Just to contrast with the earlier ingredient, right? This supply model is the sort of new ingredient. I mean, it's not like a revolution, but still, it's a new ingredient relative to the long history of these classic queuing economics papers. And it's not the first in 2018. There's, I think, Taylor in 2016, who, to my knowledge, may have had the first one in this queuing world. Of course, these types of models have been studied in economics in the absence of queuing for some time before. And just to go back to Ran's question earlier, right? Individual providers are relatively long-lived in the system, right? How long, it depends of what you find credible for a steady state analysis here. And, just in terms of queuing specifics, there might be some variability in D, the distance, there might be some variability in speed, but in the end, this is all aggregated into exponentially distributed service times, right? I don't think, again, it's an essential thing. It simplifies some of the analysis, right? Then, there's the waiting time that basically is an important building block, because it takes the demand rate and the supply and some of the stochastics, the variability, and it translates this into some performance measure that affects demand, right? So this is, sorry, this is a very standard, queuing ingredient here. I don't know. Sorry, need another glass of. I guess I don't talk that much these days at this hour. So the mean steady state waiting time comes from some, elementary queuing analysis, birth death process. You do the analysis. If you care about the structure and you haven't seen this in a while, this, partial sum term here is the probability that all servers are busy. And the second term here is just then scaling things up to figure out what is your average wait until you get to an available server, right? Now you can see that this is obviously very easy to compute, but if you want to use this as a building block for optimization, it's kind of messy. And so there's some classic approximation going back to the 70s that shows that you can fairly accurately summarize it or approximate it by this simpler term, right? And so when you plug this in, this is your waiting time. Now the analysis then does one further simplification. I mean, just if you care about the details, right? This is also a decision variable, and it becomes a little nasty there in the exponent. So here, this is just a constant, and they show through some convincing arguments that if you do the analysis with this, it's still kind of what it tells you is still appropriate, right? I'm not going to dive into these minutiae here. Just a couple of elementary queuing observations, right? If you've done a lot of queuing, this will put you to sleep. If you haven't done a lot of queuing, it's helpful to know. The first order observation is that because you have variability, even if the system is not fully utilized, you can have delays, right? And these delays can become very substantial, and they increase convexly in the utilization, right, for a fixed number of servers, right? Another thing that is also well known, but helpful to keep in mind, is that if you hold the utilization constant, but you scale up the system, that is, you increase K. So think of increasing K and lambda proportionally such that rho stays constant, right? You can see that, this term is going to drop, and the lambda is also growing, so it drops, right? So you basically get a much faster operating system at large utilization, right? So sometimes people refer to this as statistical scale economies. In essentially, you can sort of picture, hundreds of servers. And so these fluctuations are going to sort of average out, and it becomes less and less likely that you have, sort of a long buildup of a queue, right? Because there's so many available servers, right? Okay, finally, the platform is going to basically maximize this profit, right? But keeping in mind that the price is going to affect, the lambda. The lambda is going to affect the utilization is going to affect the supply is going to affect the delay, and and the wage is going to affect this, and all these things, right? So bottom line, the problem looks like this, right? This is my steady state profit rate. These are the various constraints that we developed. This is the price delay equilibrium, the price demand equilibrium. This is the waiting time approximation. This is the wage supply equilibrium. This, if you do have a fixed payout ratio, you would add this constraint. And then this is, stability, which I've added here for completeness, you wouldn't really need because, unless you foolishly choose lambda d to be larger than k mu, right, you will never want to operate with this constraint binding, right? But just for completeness, it's here, right? Before I continue, any questions or comments here? Okay.
Philipp,
Yes.
This substitution of k with a constant in the waiting time, doesn't it abstracts away the competition between drivers in a sense, or?
No, so what they do is
Oh.
the following. So keep in mind that here it's still going to, so that, keep in mind the k is still going to show up here, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if k increases, that still lowers the utilization for any one driver and how much they make and so on, right? So short answer is no, it's not going to affect the competition. What they do is they double check that their analytical results, especially when it comes to the sensitivity to parameters, right? They see that is consistent with what is found numerically, right?
So they basically conjecture some n,
yes,
solve
so
the equilibrium, and then check whether this n is consistent with k.
Yeah. So there's essentially two parts to the analysis, right? One, which is actually, let me just talk about this, and if I don't address it, remind me. But right.
Okay.
So here, since this is in the context of this workshop on stochastics and modeling and so on, right? In terms of the analysis here, right? I mean, in contrast to some of the earlier models that you've seen, this is not a model where we have no clue how should we solve it or something, right? We have static decisions. They do affect the dynamics of the stochastic system. We get a steady state equilibrium. We plug this in. We end up with a static deterministic optimization problem. It's not a large scale problem, right? So if the question is, can I somehow compute the solution? That's not a question here, right? The question is more, well, what does the solution look like? What does it tell me about what's going on in the system and so on, right? So the analysis is maybe, I don't think it's trivial, it's tricky, but it's not like I don't know how to solve this problem, right? In terms of the gain timing and information, right? I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the details, but obviously this is an abstraction of reality. The one thing I want to say is that all of this is assuming that the system is in equilibrium, right? So none of this is addressing equilibrium formation. Suppose we start off equilibrium and we iterate dynamically, are we going to reach an equilibrium or not, right? One quick observation, just for context, suppose that employees are, that the workers are employees as opposed to contractors, right? Which means that you would pay drivers also when they're idle, which goes back to Florence' question, right? So essentially here you would, you would divide by rho, which would be equivalent to saying, I'm going to have, this many people on staff and I pay them basically for their service rate, even if they're idle part of the time, right? This would also mean that the wage supply equilibrium is no longer going to be sensitive to the utilization, right? And you could do a comparison, which these guys don't do, and I'm not going to talk about it, but you could sort of study this as a benchmark and do some comparison and so on, right? A couple of comments just on, the analysis and the results, right? so these are standard techniques for nonlinear optimization. You have, Lagrangians, you need to know about convexity and implicit function theorems and all these things and so on, right? So to Ron's question from before, right? So when you fix the model parameters, right, they do prove that there exists a unique solution even if you have the k in the exponent, right? Not just some arbitrary constant n, there's some sort of iterative procedure that converges and so on and so forth, right? And then the focus of the analysis is really on what does the solution look like and how sensitive is it to the parameters, right? Yes, Florin.
I was going to ask, actually, when you compare the two systems, you said that in the paper they don't actually compare them, but is it a priori clear that one should be better than the other from a profit perspective?
Good question. Terry Taylor has, I think he wrote the first model on this kind of thing in 2016, and he did, to be honest, I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether it's obvious. I would, well, so I guess there's what confounds things in my mind is that right, you're paying them for idleness as well, so that could make you a little worse off and counterbalance the fact that you sort of tell them what to do, like that, right? But I'm not positive, and I'm not sure whether somebody has done a clean analysis of that. Right, and so much of the paper is going to look at the sensitivity of the solution to these model parameters, right? And then they also illustrate. They say, oh, let's look at some DD data, right? And so not really do an empirical fitting the model and so on, but sort of, I would say, inform the choice of model parameter values by some of what they see in the empirical data. And then they sort of explore the question of, how would the payout ratio vary over the course of a day, and what can we kind of, what does that suggest about the, the sort of the last question here, right? I'm going to show you some of these results, but without, so I think, I don't know the ins and outs of the data, so I think, it's plausible that you could substantially improve performance. Now, how much exactly? I think there's obviously lots of questions of model specification and validity in terms of, reality versus the model, right? So, okay, so before I show you sort of a few highlights of those results, this is just kind of to emphasize sort of the dynamics, so to speak, in the system, right? That, it's a simple model, but there's actually quite a few moving parts. And so if this goes up, then this goes down and so on and so forth, right? So for example, if you increase the price, holding the wage constant, of course, it affects demand directly, right? Demand is going to drop for a fixed supply, but that's going to reduce the utilization, right? And because of lower utilization, the supply would also decrease, right? Which would tend to make the service delay worse, which might again, adversely affect demand. Similarly, if you increase the wage on the supply side, holding the price constant, right? This would directly increase the supply, right? Which would improve the speed of the service, which might stimulate demand, right? Anyways, so, there's lots of different results in the paper. I thought I would just show you a couple of sort of key things, focusing on what I think are sort of two important parameters of the model. One is sort of on the demand side, the market size, the potential, the lambda bar here, right? And you can think of, again, if you think of a time scale of several hours, right? Maybe this lambda bar might be significantly different if you look at, the morning rush hour versus some lull you know, in the middle of the morning or something like that, right? So what this is showing is basically, I summarized, if you increase the market size, what happens to the optimal price, wage, payout ratio, and so on and so forth, right? The results are pretty intuitive. The platform profit is obviously going to improve as well, right? There are some informative takeaways here, such as during the rush hour, you want to raise the price to regulate the demand, right? And also, this basically means you have a higher mass of higher value customers, right? If you just scale up the demand, keeping the same, you know, valuation distribution. It turns out you want to raise the wages and even more. Notice that the payout ratio here goes up because you basically want to handle more demand with reasonable delay, right? So the delay is increasing, but you know, it's not as much as if you didn't manage to also grow the supply, right? Notice that the customers, they pay more, right? And they wait more. So that really means that you're serving more customers, but it's a smaller fraction of a larger market. And then if you look at the providers, right, in this situation, they're actually happy both because their nominal wage goes up and their utilization goes up. So they're higher effective, they have higher effective earnings, right? So this is on the demand side. If we look at something similar on the supply side, and I just put this in the row below, so this is the effect of the labor pool size, right? I'm just going to emphasize of the thing that we see here, which is some non-monotone effect of, yes.
So yeah, you said it's intuitive, but perhaps I'm missing something. So if this lambda star, the equilibrium demand is obtained in the interior, so why is increasing the lambda cap actually makes any effect? Is that because there are more customers who are now willing to buy at a lower price?
No. So think of you have you know, there's a valuation, right? So we have you know, so if I think of the values, right? Let's say it's between 0 and 1. Right, so this is the values. If you map these values to a lambda, right, it would be like this, right? It looks like this. So basically, this is like saying, you know, for a given lambda, what is the marginal willingness, you know, the marginal customer's willingness to pay? And when you increase lambda bar, right, let's say to here, you just have more high value customers, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So maybe that raises a question which you didn't ask, but maybe it's worth asking empirically is, you know, does the market size, you know, if at a given time the market size changes, is the composition of valuations invariant, or does it also change, right? Here, the model assumes that it's invariant. So you have this effect that you just have a bigger chunk of high value customers. Right?
Yeah.
So that's the reason.
I get it.
Right. Yeah. Otherwise, yeah, there would be, yeah, it wouldn't show up like this. Right. So here I'm just going to focus on the non-monotone behavior of the optimal price and the optimal utilization as you increase the labor pool size, right? First, keep in mind here that what you see here is that the, this is, okay, yeah. So notice that in this setting here, the lambda bar is fixed. The lambda star is increasing, from which you can infer that it must be the total cost of customers decreases, right? So the delay goes down, but the sum of delay cost plus price has to be diminishing. That's the only way you can get more people to actually buy for a fixed market size, right? So keeping this in mind, what happens when you increase the labor pool from a small pool size, as opposed to when you already have a substantial pool size and you increase it further, right? So basically, these things are non-monotone because of convex queuing effects, right? When the pool is small, right, the system is quite supply constrained, right, is operating at high utilization, right? And so then if you increase the supply, right, think of, you can decrease convexly the delay, right? So there's a drastic delay reduction, even if you keep the utilization constant, meaning even if you grow the lambda proportionally, right? So suddenly that makes the delay much better, opening up room for a price premium while still lowering the total cost, right? So that's kind of what happens if you have a small labor pool. If you already have a large labor pool, there's a couple of things. First of all, your system is now demand constrained. Secondly, because you have large K, a lot of servers, right? Probably your delay is already relatively good. If you further increase the supply, the delay reduction will be relatively small, right? And so to actually improve the service overall, that's going to come with a price reduction to further stimulate the demand, right? A couple of remarks here, right? So in a sort of different world where customers are not time sensitive, right? Everything would be sort of monotone. And then they also have some other results, which I'm not showing here, which are similar, that suppose you take the market size and the labor pool size and you scale them proportionally, right? Because there's a case of, or question to be asked, if you look at different time periods over the day, well, of course, we know that, demand is highly non-stationary, right? But potential supply may also be somewhat non-stationary, right? Like, I mean, to some extent, you see that the actual supply responds in a non-stationary way over the day, but some of that is driven by, incentives, both that there's more demand, that maybe it's some surge pricing and so on, right? Okay, and so in closing, I'm just going to show you some numbers, right? So without going into the specifics of, how you get these numbers. So this here is table 4 from the paper. It's just showing you, for different labor pool sizes and market demand, market sizes, right? How could the optimal payout rate, what would be the optimal payout ratio, right? And they chose some reasonable parameter values for all the other model parameters, right? And you can see that, I think for me, the main takeaway is what I put here, that ratio may vary substantially across these parameters, which makes sense, right? Now, of course, then translating that difference into profit differences, you can do that exercise, right? But the question is, well, is this empirically important or not, right? I'm sure we can cook up settings where these profit differences are substantial, right? The next thing and the last thing I will show you is just kind of hint at what they did, right? So they took some data from DD, actually a lot of data from DD. And of course, they had to make some assumptions to say, okay, based on this and this, we're going to choose these parameter values, for a peak hour, which I think was like in the, evening rush, and a non-peak hour, which might be like later at night. And using these parameters, they computed the optimal payout ratio using their model for different values of delay sensitivity, right? So to say, well, we don't really know how delay sensitive people are because, that would really require some more structural estimation or something, but we can get a sense of that. And, regardless of what the true value of C is, you can see that there's a substantial difference between these payout ratios, right? What they then also did is they said, oh, apparently at the time the payout ratio was 0.8, so a commission of 20%, right? And so you can see that depending on the time sensitivity, the profit loss could be substantial, right? So I'm going to leave it at that. I think, intuitively, it would be quite plausible that keeping the payout ratio fixed could cost you a lot in performance. How much that is in practice is going to depend on a bunch of factors, right? Okay, so just to conclude this part, right? So some conclusions: we have a stylized model of an on-demand service platform without any spatial considerations, at least, nothing that's explicitly captured. But still, you get some useful results on how to balance demand and supply through financial controls, right, in a setting where you have congestion. Further reading, and just to be clear, I'm not saying you should only read these things, and if I forgot to list your paper, right, don't be upset. These are just some things that immediately came to mind, right? Banerjee et al., I think, is probably maybe one of the first papers in this world. So they have slightly different queuing dynamics. Think of an open system where drivers can arrive. They join based on some earnings forecast, but then they might leave at some point with some probability. On the other hand, the customers are not patient at all, right? So they just make their decision based on price, and they only join if there's a driver available. Otherwise, they're out of it, right? So there's a loss system on the customer side, right? The model lends itself to some large market asymptotics where you scale up the supply rate and the demand rate, the potential rates proportionally, right? And you can simplify the analysis and so on. They look at dynamic pricing versus, state-dependent pricing as opposed to static pricing. And they find, I would say, not too surprisingly, that in the large market regime, you don't gain that much, at least in this system, by dynamic state-dependent pricing. On the other hand, you can gain quite substantially by if you allow the price to vary with non-stationary parameters, right? So not with the stochastic fluctuations, but let's say, you're doing some sort of robust type of analysis. You don't know whether the arrival rate will be, 100 or 150 or something. If you allow yourself to adjust the price based on, the realized arrival rate, you can of course do a lot better than if you don't have that flexibility, right? Taylor, I think, came before the paper I just showed you, and I think inspired in some sense that paper, right? So he looked at effects of delay sensitivity and work independence. So Florian, maybe to your question, but frankly, I don't quite remember. He focused more on how this affects price and wage levels. I'm not sure whether he has clear results on which business model clearly dominates and under what conditions. And then Ben Jafar and some colleagues looked at labor welfare implications, and in a very similar model to the one we just looked at. In particular, what are the benefits of labor pool size regulation? If you have, in certain cases, in certain regimes, you have just a lot of drivers, maybe the whole system would benefit by limiting access. And I think ideas like this have been explored also by some of the platforms. And then also effective wage regulation, right? So that might be something to look at. An entirely different focus, I think also interesting, is to consider in a single location setting heterogeneous jobs, right? So you think of like short trips and long trips, where longer trips might be more attractive because you're going to make some money, right? So Castro and some colleagues have an analysis, and I was first going to present that paper, but I thought they would take so much build up to just get to the setting that I thought better to just highlight some of the ideas, right? In some sense, it's a more advanced papers because it's looking at drivers dynamically sort of cherry picking while sitting in the queue, and how should you design the allocation of jobs to drivers to make sure that drivers' cherry picking behavior is aligned with, maximizing the value of the system. There's a couple of non-queuing models, actually more than a couple, but just, I said I was going to focus on queuing models. There's a couple of non-queuing models that look at some interesting aspects of search pricing, right? And I mean, there's lots of other models here, but these are just some thoughts, right? A few further thoughts is, I think there's room for examining some further price service discrimination approaches. There is maybe some role of congestion information. Questions like this have been studied in settings that are one-sided, but some of these things are also relevant in two-sided settings. And then coming back maybe to, in some sense, it's related to Ran's earlier question, right? All this analysis here, when they looked at rerunning their model over different time slices of the day, the notion is that each time slice is stationary and drivers are making their decision just for this time slice, right? Whereas in reality, you could imagine a driver thinking over the entire day, and that entire day will be composed of, multiple time periods that within each period look relatively homogeneous, but across periods, right, the regime of demand clearly changes, right? So, obviously more sort of subtle the analysis there, but I think that these are questions that I think might be somewhat relevant and important. Okay. Another thing that, like another way to think of a single location is to actually consider sort of a transactional view for both drivers and customers, in the sense that drivers are just arriving from somewhere, right? And they're just going to make decisions based on the next trip, right? So I think there's room for some, and there's a couple of papers that go in this direction. I think there's maybe also an interesting, so think of like a classic taxi model, but with incentives on both sides. Okay, boy. How many minutes? I guess we started 5 minutes late, so I have 5 plus 13, 18 minutes. Is that right? Florian, I guess you're the chief since the big captain is not here today.
That works for me.
Oh, he is. Okay.
I don't dare opening my video.
You don't dare because what? Okay. Anyways. All right. So so I'm going to switch gears, and as I'm showing here on the picture, I'm going to slightly edge towards the multiple location type of world, but not sort of the full view where you have imbalances and so on. And I'm going to look at what sometimes people call sort of a homogeneous space model, right? Just to motivate things, right? So the model we looked at so far cannot really capture spatial frictions that arise as a result of really distance between requests, like where the requests arise and where the vehicles are, right? And those distances will use up otherwise productive time, right? So we can think of two demand environments. On the one hand, environments where you have systematic demand imbalances on average, right? Think of in the morning, there's more people going to downtown, well, maybe not during COVID, than in the opposite direction, right? And so you either need to kind of lose a lot of demand to rebalance things, or you need counterbalancing empty vehicle flows. Sometimes people refer to this as repositioning, right? So I'm going to look at that type of question on Monday. A second situation is that on average, you have balanced demand, but still because of stochastic fluctuations, right? It's not like anytime somebody wants a trip that there happens to be a car right there, right? So you somehow need to bridge this distance, and you must basically match cars with riders and dispatch them to pick them up, right? So we're going to focus on this second situation and look at a model that is kind of doing sort of a mean value analysis for a model in steady state, and it's going to sort of look at space in a homogeneous way, right? So it's not going to capture any, it's going to assume that things are everywhere sort of homogeneous, but it's still going to allow us to capture frictions that arise because, you know, there's time missing. I mean, there's time that will be spent to move capacity empty from point A to point B. And that time, the main point is that time can be very, you know, can have very drastic adverse effects on your productive capacity, right? So the key punchline of the operational side of the model is that the customer pickup time, also called from the vehicle's perspective, the en route time, en route to the pickup, it is related to the idle vehicle density, the spatial density of idle vehicles, right? And so the discussion that is following is based on two papers, Arnott in the 90s, and then Castillo et al. More recently, that sort of popularized this notion of a wild goose chase, right? Actually, I'm just as an aside, I think in terms of time, even if we stop sort of halfway through this, I think it's not a big problem, because this actually fits perfectly with the two-part plan as announced, right? I'm certainly already entering this territory, which is announced for Monday, but it would be totally fine to continue with that before I move on to the settings with imbalanced demand that is not coming up yet. Okay, so let's go back to the same picture, but there's now a few more subtle complications here, right? So here, you know, we still have the three parties, right? Notice in this model, customers are not willing to wait to get matched with a car, right? So any waiting time for them is, I come in, I request a car, I'm instantly matched if there's a car available, but then there's a pickup time. And of course, I don't like waiting for a long time until the car arrives to me, right? But so here, you know, if you think of the customer side, the reason they wait is not because there's no car available for them to be matched with, is because that car is not at the same location as where I am, right? So this is the pickup time. A common feature to the earlier model is that, so if we look at trips, right, we can think of trips from three perspectives. On the demand side, the demand is going to be a decreasing function of pickup time, mean pickup time, and price. On the supply side, what will happen is, you know, let's say we have a supply of L drivers. Of course, they also join based on earnings and so on, but let's say you have L drivers in the system. It turns out that their supply rate is not simply L times some constant service rate, but their supply rate is endogenous, and it actually depends on the pickup time, right? And so the trip supply rate is S as a function of the labor supply and the endogenous pickup time, right? And the third quantity of trips is simply the equilibrium rate of trips, which of course you need the supply rate to match with the demand rate, right? This here is going to be a fundamental relationship, and it's actually quite intuitive. It's basically saying, okay, you know, how can drivers spend time in this model? They can be in one of three states. They can be idling, right, waiting for a request. They can be driving a customer, and the model here assumes that T is just simply the mean trip time. Or they can be en route, meaning they are dispatched, but they haven't reached the customer yet, right? And here you have the product of two endogenous quantities, right? That the pickup time, which depends on the idle car density, and the equilibrium trip supply, which also depends, the equilibrium trip rate, which also depends on the demand rate, right? And obviously this, this is simply through Little's law. We know that this has to hold on average. Finally, how do we make sure that the number of drivers that are working is actually in equilibrium? There is also a wage, which in this case is the price paid to customers, a fixed commission rate. So drivers retain 1 minus tau. They look at their utilization, and in a similar fashion as what you saw earlier, that's going to determine how many drivers are willing to wait, right? So the lower the utilization, that has adverse effects on the driver supply. The higher the net wage, right, that increases the labor supply, right? Does that make sense? At least at this level, we're going to dive into more details, but are there any sort of immediate questions? All right. Okay, so let's look at the demand side. That's fairly simple here, right? Consider a large homogeneous region. Customers request rides at a rate dt of p per unit time and unit area, right? Think of things that are totally uniformly homogeneous over space, right? If you pick any origin destination pair, right, it has the same rate of demand for that origin destination pair, right? So if you were to aggregate these origin destination pair rates, right, at any point in this space, you would see that there's a balance between average inflows of arrivals of terminated trips and average outflows, right? So there's no structural imbalances, which is what I was mentioning as an other possibility earlier, and that we will look at on Monday, right? So T is the mean pickup time and P is the price, right? Some reasonable assumptions on what this demand rate looks like. The mean trip time is little t, right? The labor supply, right? So here is where things get maybe more interesting, right? So the region is served by drivers that are distributed with some supply density of L per unit area, right? This here is a fairly intuitive equilibrium supply requirement, which is very similar to what we saw earlier. It's just that this paper uses different notation, right? This is the utilization, right? Where you have the number of trips, and this is the number of drivers. And this is the net wage or payment per trip. L is simply some differentiable increasing function, right? And Q is the equilibrium number of trips per unit time and unit area, right? So we still need to specify what this Q has to satisfy, right? And you can see that, of course, if the price goes up, that's great. If Q goes up, that's great, more labor, right? If there's more labors joining, that's going to depress these earnings, so things need to be in balance, right? We already looked at this relationship, right? The next thing, which is really the key thing in this model, is to see what is the relationship between these two quantities, right? So these two quantities are actually linked to each other, right? So this is the average pickup time, and this is the average number of idle vehicles, right? And the fundamental observation is that there's a trade-off between the en route time and the idle time, right? And the picture hopefully is going to show this, right? On the left picture, you have a situation where there's few idle vehicles. On the right side, you obviously have more idle vehicles, right? Suppose that a request arrives here, right? Well, there's fewer idle vehicles, so there's a higher chance that, one of them gets the request, right? So vehicles have to wait relatively less time, sitting idle until the next request, right? On the other hand, because there's fewer vehicles around, right? On average, it's going to take longer to get to the closest vehicle, right? I mean, the distance to the closest vehicle is longer, right? And of course, on this side, it's just the opposite, right? You have more drivers that are competing for whatever is going to be the next request, right? But then once a request shows up, likely somebody is pretty close by, right? So from this, then we need to develop a simple relationship between the idle car density and the dispatch time, right? Now, for this, it's critical to specify what is the protocol for dispatching or the matching algorithm, if you want, right? And the idea here is that in this papers, at least they start out with a so-called first dispatch protocol, or think of just, it's going to be a rider request comes in, is basically going to match to the nearest driver, right? The mean pickup time, they assume it to be, decreasing convex, where if in the number of idle vehicles, if there's no idle vehicles, this pickup time is going to blow up. As the number of idle vehicles goes up, right, this pickup time vanishes, right? Think of lots of idle cars everywhere, right? And so because this is, strictly monotone, the inverse function, which is used in some of the analysis, has, the same properties, right?
Philipp, quick question, is that okay?
Yes.
Just clarifying. So are we on a two-dimension here? Like when
yes, yes. Although there's a whole, I would say there's a whole branch of literature that studies these things, and two-dimensional with Euclidean distance versus like the Manhattan distance versus like there's lots of variations, and in the paper they also fit something to then estimate a specific TI function. So I'll show you one example, which is just kind of the most obvious, simple abstraction. But there's, you can even think of this in 3D if we go into the age of drones and, for delivery, not for bombing people. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right. So, here's just one example, right? Suppose that idle vehicles are distributed according to a two-dimensional spatial Poisson process, right? And, you can just drive straight line, right? So in this case, if the request is here, what's the probability that the distance to the closest idle vehicle is larger than X, right? Basically, the probability that there's no idle vehicles in an area of a radius X, which is this simple expression here. And if you want to average this out over the distribution of X, right, you get this simple expression here. So I'm just putting this in here to sort of show you one example, a simple example of, this thing being like, IT sort of looking like this, right? Let me just find a good, I think we have 2 minutes, right? So I think I'm going to get to a picture, and then on Monday, we probably don't need more than 10 minutes to wrap up this thing. That will leave 80 minutes. I think it's a smooth transition. So as long as you're fine with it, I'm okay with it. Does that work for you? Yes? Okay.
Go ahead.
Right. Okay. Right. So, so now that we have this, right, this gives us a simple but important characterization of the trade-off between idle vehicles and pickup time, right? And so, remember that, so if we, without assuming equilibrium, right? So before we saw this relationship with Q instead of S, but if you just say, okay, I have L vehicles, a density of L vehicles in the system, what is the supply rate of these L vehicles as a function of not just how many servers or vehicles I have, but also what is the pickup time, right? So if you look at this relationship and you simply express this in terms of the supply rate of the system as a function of, if you will, the number of servers and the pickup time, right? You can see that in some sense, the trip supply rate of non-idle servers is state dependent through the pickup time, right? So it's like saying, if from a sort of classic queuing perspective, is you have like service times that are state dependent, right? And the state is really, you know, how many servers are idle, right? The fewer servers are idle, right, is going to reduce, you know, the fewer servers are idle, that's going to correlate to a large pickup time. And that's going to increase the service time of any given server. Of course, not the entire service time is productive. Only this portion of it is productive time. And the rest is I just have to get to a passenger, right? So, you know, here's a simple proposition that is just characterizing what the supply looks like. And let me maybe end with this picture here, right? So on this picture, there's a lot of things going on. I want you to focus on this. Actually, let me use a different color for this, right? Focus on this curve here. Notice here, it's been tilted on its side. So you have on the horizontal axis, the pickup time, and sorry, on the vertical axis, the pickup time. And this is showing you, as the pickup time increases, what happens to the supply rate, right? So first of all, the smallest pickup time that you can have is if all the vehicles are idle, right? But then, of course, your supply rate is 0 because everybody is idle, but at least the pickup time is going to be minimized, right? If then requests come in, right, drivers, because there's lots of them around, right, they spend little time to reach a customer, they match with the nearby riders, and the supply rate goes up quite significantly, right? As the supply rate goes up, right, you now have fewer idle vehicles. The en route time goes up. If you remember the picture, right, the density of idle vehicles spreads out. Any request that comes in is on average further away from the nearest idle driver, right? And at this point, you know, the system starts to choke on the long pickup times, right? So if you want more and more requests, at some point things are going to peak, right? But then things are actually going to get worse, right? In this sort of decreasing part, if you think of it, the drivers are spending more time en route to match with distant riders, right? That eats up time and capacity and so on. And, you know, this could get very bad, right? And so let me close on this last slide here for today, and that's going to be a good connection for Monday. Suppose now, so we're not looking at equilibrium analysis yet, right? Just keep focusing on this curve here. But clearly, because it has this peak, right, you can say, okay, suppose I want this many trips, right? There are two ways to achieve this many trips, right? There is what they call the good outcome, right? Where you have short en route times, right? And so that means better pickup times, customers are happy, right? Or you could have what they call a wild goose chase, which is basically long pickup times where you're still achieving the same number of trips, but cars are spending a lot of time driving long distances to pick up customers, right? So let me close here for today. Basically, the 2-3 things we'll look at for this model before we move on to the next model is how can you use pricing to make sure that you don't end up in a wild goose chase in equilibrium, and how can you use non-pricing tools, in particular matching, more clever matching, to avoid this situation. And the paper has some nice sort of empirical estimates to show how effective these things are in practice for some Uber data, right? So, but let me close here today. I'm happy to take some questions. This is not quite the end yet, to be continued, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to stick around.
All right. First, I'm sorry again, something came up and I couldn't even connect. So thanks, Florent, for taking the lead, and Philippe, but I owe you one. Thank you, everyone, and have a great weekend. Okay. And we'll see you on Monday. All of you. Right. I'll be here 10 minutes before.
All right.
Have a good one. Philippe, if you have a few minutes, do you mind staying?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.